Ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure and privilege to lead this seminar. The title is Russian Economy, COVID-19 Impact, Outlook, and Strategic Options. My name is Andrew Afanasyev. I'm from an advisory firm called Strategic Choice Advisory. And with me today is my longtime friend and business partner, Ilya Gnoensky from Turnarounds. We'll say a couple of words about ourselves, and after that, we'll start our presentation. As I said, my name is Andrew. I was born and grew up in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I moved to Russia with my parents when I was in high school in the early 90s. Received my university education here in Russia at Moscow State University. I'm an economist, and I've been working since 1997 as a business analyst, consultant, investment banker, and 11 years ago started my consulting practice. We as a company focus on servicing foreign companies in Russia and other markets. I speak Chinese, also learning Japanese now, and most of our clients are foreign companies, most of them Asian companies. In a given year, maybe 60 to 90% of our client base are foreign companies, and maybe only 10 to 40% of the markets we work on happen to be Russia. We also work in other former Soviet countries, Southeast Asia, Israel lately. We sometimes do projects in Western markets, and also we help Russian companies doing business in Asia to work on those markets. We do feasibility studies of investment projects with heavy concentration on oil, gas, and chemical sector, and also healthcare. We do efficiency improvement programs, forensic studies for banks and shareholders, and other efficiency improvement advisory projects. Ilya, can you say a couple of words about yourself, please?
Thanks, Andrew. Real quick, my background is in turnarounds and financial restructuring. I have accounting and finance background in the United States. I'm a registered and licensed certified public accountant in the United States. And most of my career there, I worked either at PwC in audit and assurance, or in turnarounds and restructuring of medium-sized companies located in the Midwest. I've been back to Russia for about now 5+ years, and I've been busy helping medium-sized companies that are either foreign in Russia or Russian companies, help them with financial modeling, restructuring, turnarounds, and helping them to become more profitable. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us, and let's get started.
Yeah. All right. So in this very unusual and turbulent time, we bring to you the seminar on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Russian economy, the outlook, and what to do in these circumstances. Now, there are multiple questions faced by, let's see, maybe a question to the organizers. How do I remove the panel on top? I hope it stays there. I hope it doesn't block the view. A lot of questions faced now by entrepreneurs, by foreign companies. Excuse me, a question to the organizers, to the moderator. This sort of window keeps popping up on top and blocking the slide titles. How do I avoid that? Can you help me?
See it.
Is everything visible here?
We can see your slides clearly.
Yeah, it's
okay,
fine.
so it's only on my screen. I see.
Right. That's right.
Okay, so time to time someone new joins and this whole thing slides down and blocks the view. But anyway, if you're fine, then I'm fine. So the main question really is, for a lot of companies, and the greatest uncertainty, how long will this epidemic last? Is there any hope for a vaccine or treatment anytime soon? Is it something that will blow over in just a couple of months, or is this more prolonged? what to do with my business, what awaits the Russian country market in my particular industry. A lot of the foreign companies are also facing downsizing issues. Their business has contracted in this market. At the same time, I know there are a lot of companies who are looking for new opportunities, who think this may be a good time to get in. And we welcome you on board the seminar. We'll be happy to outline some prospects across different industries for you. And what kind of changes are taking place in the Russian economy? There's a massive shift in customer preferences, at least for the time being. People are going online. Everything's becoming more distanced and remote. The question is whether it will last, and how should a company transform its business in Russia to reflect the new realities? Now, as I said just a moment earlier, we do a lot of work in the healthcare sector. We do feasibility studies of clinics, hospitals, laboratories, medical equipment manufacturing projects, and also pharmaceuticals. We do work on COVID-19 treatment options. We previously worked on diagnostics. And I'm just going to say a couple of words about the time frame that we're all facing here. We've examined, obviously, the various pandemics, and especially flu-related viruses that have plagued our world over the past century. We do find strong similarities between COVID-19 and the so-called Spanish flu, the influenza of 1918-1920. We do believe that we're looking at several waves of outbreaks of this epidemic. They may coincide with the seasonal flu outbreaks in autumn and spring, and they may be exacerbated by people not observing certain restrictions, and the easing of restrictions may lead to localized outbreaks in different places. And unfortunately, this is our base case scenario. We must note that these kind of viruses, including coronaviruses, on which we've been working on for quite some time, they sometimes disappear. They go away, maybe to become stronger and more effective, whether it's being able to infect more people or to effectively kill more organisms that they infest. And they come back years later, decades later sometimes. But there is a possibility that this virus might all of a sudden go away. There is a possibility, it's not a given, that it may become less aggressive. But in any case, we strongly believe that businesses have to prepare for 2-3 years of easing and reinstating the restrictions, 2-3 years of turbulence, and certain structural shifts in consumer preferences will be taking place. We believe they'll be getting more entrenched, and we have to be prepared for that. We also have to be open to the possibility that the virus may go away at some point or become less aggressive. So we have to think in scenarios. We have to think in different paradigms for our business, depending on how this epidemic develops. Now, in the first section of this seminar, we'll speak about the macroeconomic aspects of how the Russian economy is handling this pandemic so far. Luckily, just 2 weeks ago, we got the latest data on April released by the Russian government. So we'll be talking a little bit about that, how the economy is reacting. We also developed a balanced scorecard of the impact of this pandemic on various economic sectors, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. And after that, we'll present our outlook, what will be happening over the next couple of years. After that, there will be a session for Q&A in the middle of this seminar to ask questions on the macroeconomic part. And after that, we'll proceed to looking at how businesses can react to this pandemic. What are the strategic options available? What are the new business models that may be of interest for you? And what opportunities you may pursue in the Russian economy in the next several years? Now, looking at the macro picture, it's not very different from most of the countries worldwide that have been seriously affected, like Russia. Growth was holding up fairly well all the way through April, but severe contraction started to be observed in a number of sectors in April already. May's data not yet available, but we believe a similar picture will be seen over the course of this year. Lockdown and restrictive measures have forced industries to shut doors. And now already industries that are formally not under the restrictions, they can operate, like cargo transportation, manufacturing. They're starting to feel the effect. The chain reaction has already started, and they're also starting to reduce output of goods and services respectively. Inflation so far has been pretty tame. It accelerated only slightly. It was at just over 2% year on year at the end of last year, and in the first quarter of this year, it accelerated to 3.1% in April. The latest numbers were just released end of the day Friday. It's around that level in May, around 3%. It's mainly driven by food prices. People are hoarding supplies. Certain things like toilet paper were also in high demand, and prices increased there as well. Ruble depreciation has also contributed to inflation accelerating, but at the same time, inflation so far remains subdued. So this is different to what was seen in 2014, 2015, when the Western sanctions kicked in and the ruble depreciated sharply. Inflation shot up. So far, so good, but this is only due to weak purchasing power. PPI deflation is painting a starkly different picture. There's strong deflation observed, more than 10% year on year already in April, and we expect this to persist throughout the year. Unemployment has shot up. You can see official employment grew 3.5-fold. This is to a significant extent due to government introducing various benefits and furlough schemes for workers, so they're incentivized to register as unemployed. But the ILO definition unemployment didn't grow that sharply from 4.6%, but it still did hit a 9-year high, 5.8%. So obviously things are deteriorating in terms of unemployment. Income and wage data has stopped being published. We don't think it's because authorities are trying to conceal something. Their methodologies and numbers have been more or less reliable over the years, but they're fine-tuning the methodologies, but it's clear that incomes have been hit badly. We wouldn't buy into banking sector data too much, and we won't be quoting it in this report because the various government support measures do affect how credit quality and overdue debt is treated, various ratios, capital adequacy, how it's observed. But fallouts will be natural, and we can expect certain fallouts in the banking sector later in the year. There is a significant risk that the government will start retracting the relief measures, but the economy will not have recovered enough by that point to ensure that banks stay alive and well. So we may see some fallouts there. In terms of foreign trade data, the latest data is only available through March. Exports were already down 20% year on year because of much lower oil prices. Again, because we're thinking in waves and we're thinking in further outbreaks, this may persist. We do expect that lower exports will also shrink the trade surplus. It remains to be seen to what extent the prices may recover, but generally Russian market liquidity is bound to be under significant pressure in the next couple of years. There are ample government reserves built up. Stabilization fund, welfare fund should be used quite actively by authorities. So not time to yell Hail Mary, but definitely should be careful in terms of liquidity. Imports are bound to suffer more. They only decreased by a couple of percentage points through March. We expect that to accelerate. So basically, we're in for a rough ride. Things may not be as bad as many people fear, but definitely things to watch out for. Now we move on to the statistics part of this presentation. First of all, before we go to the balanced scorecard and look at how things are expected to develop going forward across different industries, you may you can take a look at where things were just before this pandemic hit. A note here that although you see some burgundy colored cells, they're basically just to reflect that growth decelerated in key sectors compared to the previous year and also 2017. In some of the cases, like for example, cargo transport turnover, railways construction growth was still above zero, but it just slowed considerably actually compared to previous years. So we're using this sort of traffic light color coding scheme here with red. The red end of the spectrum reflecting something bad or negative taking place. Yellow is somewhere in the middle, and green means that things are going fairly well. So if we look at the sectors now, where were we just before this pandemic hit? Our main observation throughout 2019 was that growth in B2B oriented sectors was already slowing after the recovery from the Western sanctions. You can see, for example, that industrial output growth slowed in 2019. Cargo transport turnover, which is a leading economic indicator, growth there also slowed to just 0.6%, one of the lowest readings in years compared to 5.5 in 2017 and 2.7 in 2018. If you look closer, why we're talking about B2B sectors here versus B2C. Railway, which is a B2B, not last mile transportation segment, we saw growth contract sharply to 0.2%. At the same time, automobile, truck transport mostly, which is closer to the last mile, thus a B2C oriented sector, growth there accelerated sharply to 5.8% compared to no more than 2.3% in previous years. By the same token, agriculture, although a lot of the produce gets processed in manufacturing, so it does supply a significant share of output to the B2B channel, to food processing, but it's driven by end consumption, and that was feeling very well. There was a slight slip up in 2018 due to bad weather, an exceptionally cold summer in a lot of places, but generally the sector was feeling very well. If you look at retail, yes, growth slowed after recovering to 2.8%, but still above zero and much better than in 2014, 2016, when we were seeing drops of 4 to 10% per year. So generally more or less okay. If we look at construction, growth slowed sharply. There was some distortion in the numbers because of the massive $28 billion Yamal LNG project being launched in 2018, and that lifted the 2018 figure. But still, if you look at the breakdown, housing construction was feeling fairly well, grew 4.9%, just started to recover. That means that all other construction here, where you see 0.6%, actually contracted quite strongly, and that was industrial and commercial real estate. So that was shrinking. And so we see that a lot of the B2C sectors are actually recovering, feeling much better than the B2B oriented ones. This is only natural as the Western sanctions actually helped a lot of the sectors. They were driven by import substitution, and maybe growth sectors started to moderate by 2019. For example, if you look at medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, you see growth of 30–40% year on year. This is production. Pharmaceuticals, almost 20% last year. If we look at soft drinks, bottled water, other sectors, computers and electronics, quite a positive picture seen across the board. A lot of these sectors are driven by end consumption. Medical equipment and pharmaceuticals wouldn't have been growing if the demand for localized production wasn't there from patients. And generally, a lot of positivity was there just before this pandemic hit. So if you're looking at how much the sectors are expected to recover. You can remember the 2019 figures, 2018, and we believe that a lot of the sectors will come back to similar levels once the epidemic has eased. On the negative side, though, we see that a lot of the equipment oriented sectors, again, B2B, electrical equipment, tractors, metal cutting equipment, automobiles, especially truck tires, they were either contracting or growth slowed significantly. So the trends were mixed. B2C sectors were generally feeling better in 2019. B2B growth was moderating. Maybe some of the impetus provided by import substitution was already fading away. And then this pandemic hit. And let me first explain the methodology real quick. So again, we're using this sort of traffic light color coding scheme. There's a color legend at the bottom of the next slide. Sectors performing especially well, bright red, they're growing exceptionally quickly. Again, we're working on a one
Okay, I think we have some technical problems. Ilya, could you continue for now? Okay, some technical problems. Please just wait for some minutes.
Test, test, test. Colleagues, I think we may be having some technical difficulties.
Colleague, 1 minute, please. Technical problems.
Включить звук. Так, видео не работает все еще. Okay, so I hope I'm back. There was something with the Wi-Fi at my location. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Let me share my screen. Sorry for the disruption. There was something with the Wi-Fi network, совместное использование. И, Виктор, как мне отключить комментарии на экране? Так, комментирование или еще? Да. Got it. Okay. Well, I hope that does it. All right, presentation. Все, спасибо. Okay, I'm back. Great. So to continue, let me just pull this down a bit. Collapse. Yes. Okay, so where were we? What did you hear last before I broke off?
Just the color coding that you were explaining.
The color coding. Okay, so the greener, the better, the redder, the worse. First of all, the bright green, the 5s, is where performance is exceptionally strong. Again, we're assigning scores on a 1 through 5 scale. The higher the score, the better things are in a particular industry. The lower, the worse, conversely. Now, dark green 4 means the sector is expected to feel or is feeling now very well. Lighter green means it's above average, definitely a good sector to be in. Yellow doesn't mean that it's a warning sign. Things are not about to fall apart in this sector, unlike when you're standing at a traffic light. So 3 is more or less safe and stable. And then as we move toward the more orange segments, the lightest orange shade means it's generally okay and still better than average, but there may be some issues as the recovery may take longer than some other sectors and so on. And then as we move toward the red end of the spectrum, the bright orange, the reds are where things are falling through. Now, I'm not going to put this up on the slides because the sectors are just too diverse, but generally the way we assign scores is that if you look at 2019 and if you look at the current part of 2020, which means data through January, April of this year, where we have a 5 means that growth was in the tens of percentage points. Where it's a 4, it means growth was anywhere from 4 or 5% to maybe 10, 12%, higher single digits, lower tens. 3 is basically growth of a couple of percentage points, lower single digits, or maybe just around 0. So generally feeling okay, but not too robust. 2 is basically for, if you look at the current performance, 2 is where the sectors have contracted by somewhere up to 10%. So maybe from -2 to -10%, and 1 is where the contraction is in the tens of percentage points. Now, if we look at 2019, you see a generally positive picture. There are certain outperformers already, like pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, and healthcare services. A number of sectors feeling perfectly well, including food and beverages, wood products, chemicals, building materials, computers and electronics, machinery and equipment. A lot of sectors were feeling quite well. A lot of sectors were in the yellow, means growth of ±0. But generally feeling okay. Extraction was already starting to feel the effect of lower prices, especially in oil and gas. But what happened in 2020, and again, these numbers are assigned based on January-April data, and as we do expect a second wave toward the end of the year, sometime in autumn, we are retaining these scores throughout the end of 2020. What happened is, as you can see, growth started to slow down in a number of sectors. Contraction was started being observed, and I'll get to that in just a minute. We'll walk through some of the sectors here, but just to explain the methodology. Midterm is for 2021. Long term is through 2023, it would be difficult to make meaningful forecasts for future years at this point. So only through 2023. And there are also weights in the balanced scorecard for each of the horizons. We assign a higher weight to short-term dynamics because this is what we know for this year. It's a little bit more difficult to look out further beyond 2020. That's why lower scores for midterm and long-term performance. Long-term, we could have assigned a higher score, but again, difficult to make predictions, and therefore we assign equal scores. So in the end, we get this weighted balanced scorecard for the outlook across industries. And so far, the more or less safer bets are still chemicals, also pharmaceuticals, medical equipment. There's also IT and communication and healthcare services. This seems quite obvious, but our outlook is positive, and we confirm that these sectors are expected to perform very well going forward. Other sectors to consider, there's agriculture, R&D and innovation, above average. There's education, utilities and services. There's delivery services, obviously, as we're becoming more distanced. There food and beverages expected to continue performing strongly, and so on. Now, there's no time to go through each individual sectors. Please send in your questions either in the chat or orally. We'll be happy to pick those up in the questions and answers sections. Also, if we don't have enough time to answer all the questions, we'll get back to you after the seminar. Now for some general trends with some examples. What can we expect going forward? Of course, the second, third, and subsequent waves do dampen recovery prospects for a lot of the sectors. Things may be evolving in waves, and you have to be mindful of that. We generally expect the sectors driven by import substitution to recover faster. For example, computers and electronics, machinery and equipment, R&D, chemicals. If you look at where they were pre-coronavirus, they were performing very strongly. A lot of the 4s and even 5s here. And even though output has started contracting in these sectors, we do expect a lot of these sectors to recover, and for them to recover faster than other sectors out there. Sectors boosted by crisis demand are expected to return to normalized performance in the long run. So food and beverages, agriculture, delivery services, pulp, paper, and printing, which is feeling quite well right now, surprisingly, because pulp and paper are used in a lot of the medical supplies, and respirators, and various pads and other things used in healthcare. They will return to normalized performance sometime by 2022. As you can see here, for example, pulp, paper, and printing, we expect growth to moderate going forward. Same thing in food and beverages, agriculture, delivery services as well. So you may want to be careful if you want to get in now. This phenomenon will be rather short-lived. Also, we have to say that some sectors that are holding up fairly well are expected to slump, but again, they should recover to positive readings toward 2022. This is our prediction, including textile and apparel, cargo transportation. So a rebound is to be expected, and that's a good thing. Words of caution, certain sectors will be supported by additional infrastructure investments. For example, construction, building materials, metal products, certain chemicals. This is in the framework of emergency response and situation planning. And we do expect growth to pick up and be supported in those sectors, even though they have slumped. Some of them, like metal products, for example, or building materials. But in the long run, again, growth should normalize and slow. So if you can make use of the opportunity in these sectors, please do. But remember that in a couple of years, things should be going back to normal. Also, a couple of words of caution about outperforming industries. We know that there's pent-up demand and a lot of attention. I wonder if I can move this to the side a bit. Bingo. In healthcare, medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, IT, but you have to be very careful which segment you're actually in. Even in healthcare, for example, infectious diseases are getting a lot of attention now, face masks, respirators, but other segments are already suffering, including cancer treatment, including dialysis. A lot of things are not seeing the investments that have been budgeted. So you have to be careful whether your particular market segment will actually be able to benefit from this pandemic. Also, in sectors enjoying increased attention, you may experience severe competition. As we say, the windows of opportunity will widen, but there will be dozens and dozens of companies all trying to squeeze in, and there may be some lower margins for a lot of the sectors. So please be careful, do your homework and financial planning well if you plan on expanding in these industries. Now, I'd like to ask you to submit any questions you may have. For the moderators, are there any particularly interesting questions in our chat at this point? Or maybe you can raise your hand and ask your questions orally. We have a couple of minutes for that before we move on to the solutions and strategies for companies. Anyone?
Well, since we don't have questions from our listeners, I actually wanted to ask a question, but I'm hoping that will be interesting to our listeners. Andrew, as you have gone through a fairly detailed scorecard and gave us an idea of what will develop and how in the next couple of years, can you tell us a little bit about how these types of forecasts are made and what assumptions usually go into making a forecast 1, 2, or 3 years in the future? How are these things done in general, and anything you can tell us about your methodology or methodologies that you've noticed from your research?
Yeah, basically we conduct a semi-annual macroeconomic review, and we look at all the numbers, where things are with different industries, how they're trending compared to 6 months ago. We normally do that sometime in January, February, covering full year figures, and then again in July, August. So we do look at historic trends. And in terms of the effect of the pandemic, we do compare whether there's extra room for these sectors to grow and whether we're going to see some deferred growth. So we do expect that a lot of the industries will rebound to the rate of growth observed before this pandemic. In forecasting also, we look at country-to-country comparisons. What is the capacity for market to grow? For example, what is per capita consumption of different products and services in Russia compared to other markets? And we decide how quickly Russia will be catching up in different sectors. So we decide whether Russia is expected to hit levels seen in other markets, or at what ratio. So for example, 60% of consumption in Western markets, or we choose proxies in developing markets, and decide how quickly this particular industry is expected to reach that level over what number of years? 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. Also, we look at the main drivers. Sectors only grow when investments happen in those industries. So we do track investments by industry very closely. We know that production tends to increase when, there's additional capacity being introduced, or when existing capacity utilization increases. So we track those numbers, and we try to assess, where are investors going to go? Which sectors are going to get the funding to increase production? That depends on a number of factors. There's import substitution, there's government support for production localization. Those sectors are growing especially quickly. We also look at the consumer baskets for goods and services, the shares of different products and services therein. We try to predict what share of a consumer's budget this or that product is expected to take relative to now. So that also helps to see which industries are going to see increased consumption and therefore will be motivated to increase output.
Thanks, Andrew. I encourage our listeners to reach out to Andrew after the presentation or at some point in the future to ask more detailed questions about your specific industry or specific industry that you're interested in, since he has accumulated that wealth of knowledge. Now, we do have a question from Andre, which I'm not 100% sure I understand, but maybe Andrew, you will. Here's the question. What current crisis problems are handmade, not natural?
In terms of the virus origins, I wonder?
That's what I'm trying to clarify. I wrote Andre in the chat, but haven't received the reply yet. So it's the question is, the way it's formulated is not very clear.
Okay. So to what extent maybe, leaving the question of the virus origins aside, whether it's man-made or naturally occurring, we tend to believe that this is a naturally occurring virus. There are more than 30 known coronaviruses residing.
I apologize, Andrew. I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Andre just clarified what he means by handmade.
Okay.
Handmade in his question means bad management.
Bad management by government or company?
So what are the crises? I think what he's saying is what current crisis problems are basically due to bad management. So maybe I think the way to interpret is given the crisis situation, what are the problems that are induced by bad management that could have been handled better on the level of the company?
Let's, I suggest we answer that as we move along, because our next section happens to be devoted to the way companies respond, and it starts with key issues and risks for foreign businesses. We will also talk about what companies can do and maybe what they're not doing yet to tackle this this crisis. So if Andre is not against it, maybe we'll continue with further slides, and a lot of the answers will be found there.
Yeah, let's do it.
Any other questions before we continue? All right, let's.
So I just got another question from looks like also from Andre. Как в России эволюционируют, мутируют модели корпораций? So translation would be how in Russia corporate models evolve. I think we can probably take that question also as a part of the next slides, because there is
possible crisis strategies and business models for economic sectors. So alternative business model options, we'll talk about that in this section.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, great. So let's continue. We have to be mindful of the time. I think we have about I'd say 20, 25 more minutes before the final round of Q&A. So we have a couple of slides here. Let's talk about the key issues and risks for foreign businesses. A lot of them are well known to you. I assume there are a lot of foreign companies in the audience. I could see some familiar faces popping up as we were going through the slides. So you know quite well the kind of issues faced, but just let's go through some Russian specifics here. First of all, even sectors holding up more or less may deteriorate quickly. So if you're in, if you rely on vertical industries, whether suppliers or your customers are further down the value chain, and if things are holding up so far so good, this can be expected to change. And with further waves of the epidemic or just general economic weakness, these sectors may actually start to deteriorate. The main question, I guess, for foreign companies, and this has always been a big issue for foreign companies in Russia specifically, due to non-payment problems on the side of the customers, is whether the customers will be able and willing to pay. Suppliers may also go bankrupt, go under, and start failing your business. So you may want to plan and develop contingency measures for such situations. Also, in terms of government regulation and support measures, what we noticed over the last couple of months, and this is not a problem specific to Russia only, we see that in other places where we work. A lot of the support measures are still quite obscure. They're convoluted. A lot of them are available only in Russian because they mainly target local companies, and it may be difficult to find a reliable source of information. So Ilya, in a couple of slides, will try to sum up what is available, and there's also a couple of links you can refer to that we provide here. But so far, I wouldn't call it a mess. There are very adequate measures that are provided by authorities, but finding out how to make use of these relief measures is a thing in itself. That said, authorities generally tend to react to public criticism. There are various business associations, not the least of which is the Trade and Industry Chamber, on whose platform we're doing this seminar. They also lobby for various support measures for businesses, so you may want to find out what they're up to. I'm sure there are certain resources available on the Trade and Industry Chamber website as well, and you can reach out to them for support. Authorities generally tend to react to public criticism. This we find very positive. If things aren't working to plan, certain measures are introduced to fix that. For foreign companies especially, I know this is a big risk, and I know that working in Russia, perhaps we should be advocating companies to launch local production and to expand operations here. But the risk over the last couple of years for foreign companies has been that local businesses and locally manufactured products have been getting oftentimes disproportionate support in various tenders, and also in this pandemic, government support measures may be skewed in favor of local businesses or locally manufactured goods. This is something to consider. If you haven't localized yet, you may want to finally do that before it's too late. But in general, you have to be mindful that as we move forward, as the economy continues to suffer, and we really haven't seen the worst of the impact of this pandemic yet, measures to support local companies will be stepped up further. Now, another thing to watch out for is that recent ruble depreciation has not been fully reflected in input prices yet. as I said earlier, during the Western sanction crisis, inflation shot up. That hasn't happened yet. Producer prices are falling, but even though the ruble is strengthening again now, oil prices are growing, input price hikes cannot be excluded. And in my 23 years of working as a business consultant, I've learned very well that prices in Russia tend to go only up. They do come down sometimes, but not to the original levels, even once the inflationary factors have gone away fully. So if you haven't felt it yet, input prices for your business, if you're working in Russia, will be increasing. So you have to be aware. Also, purchasing power is expected to remain weak. There's oversaturation in various sectors and margins can be reduced. But you have to take it, I guess, calmly. This is only a natural process. So if you report to your headquarters, do make them aware of the fact that margins can be eroded going forward. So this is the risks. We'll also talk about the opportunities and what to do with it all in further slides. And now I hand the mic over to Ilya for the government support measures. And Ilya, if you need me to move to further slides, just let me know. And
yeah, thanks, Andrew. So let's talk about government support. And now let's go through a couple of things here. Obviously, when we talk about government support for foreign companies, we're assuming that a lot of foreign companies will have some sort of legal representation in Russia. So they will have legal entities established in Russia. So what is really the list? The list is very long and it's very complicated. We've listed most of the initiatives here, but you really are going to need to do independent research to examine specifically if your company or if your project is going to qualify for this or that initiative. So basically, many of these initiatives are only available for what's called systemically important or what backbone organizations. Currently, there are 1,139 of them, and I have a link here. It's on the bottom of the slide where all these organizations are named. Or these measures are available for specific industries that are deemed to have suffered the most from the pandemic. Now, who deemed them to be suffered? Obviously, the government. That's what the government said. That may or may not necessarily be the fact when you look at the job losses. Thank you, Andrew. Basically, this is a laundry list of these industries. You can look at them right here. Pretty self-explanatory, logical list. You know, when you go top down, you see transportation, culture, and leisure, entertainment, outdoor activities, hospitality, catering, conferences, and interestingly enough, healthcare. Although, as Andrew showed in the previous slide, healthcare is holding up pretty well, and it's forecasted to do the same in the future. So there's interesting mismatch here. So let's go back to previous slides. And one more. Yeah, right here. No, actually, right here. Okay, so let's look at the list and let's walk through some of the initiatives. So most of the initiatives, just like you will see these initiatives in many other countries, including the United States, are focused on small, medium enterprises. Again, these initiatives need to be examined on case-by-case basis. So what are these initiatives? So you will have initiatives like a bankruptcy moratorium, right? So for a specific time limit, creditor applications are suspended. You will have tax audits moratoriums. So you don't have any field audits for medium-sized or small enterprises. You will have, you've had automatic renewals of licenses. You have debt payment grace periods, again, for small, medium enterprises, up to 6 months. You have zero interest salary loans. So basically what does that mean? That means businesses can borrow interest-free to cover up to 6 months worth of salaries to current employees. Now, there are limits again to these amounts. There is a ceiling level. It's in many cases much lower than the actual salaries, and only if 90% of staff payroll is retained by the company. Let's move forward.
Yep.
Okay, other initiatives, you have rent deferment, right? So if you're renting from state, municipal, or private property, you can use some of those exclusions. You have direct grants if if your business is one of these 11 industries or sectors that I've shown previously. You will have some reduction in federal insurance payments. You have tax holidays, again, for these 11 specifically affected sectors. And last but not least, you have airport subsidies, which is, again, something that we have seen. Airport subsidies and airline subsidies. We've seen that across the world. Frankly, it was kind of difficult to find all the initiatives that Russian government has put forward. And so we have presented you with a couple of links here that could help you if you're looking for these initiatives and trying to decide if your business or organization could qualify for any of those. You could visit one of these two links below.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we move forward?
Yep.
Great. So now let's talk about the bright side of things. There's a lot of good things to be found in government support measures, obviously, but also what are the opportunities presented by some of the structural shifts in the economy? First of all, opportunities still abound in manufacturing, and you will get this presentation. You can look at all the scores and the statistics. You can see that it seems to be holding up better, and it is holding up better than extraction and services. A lot of government support for import substitution and production localization. Also to note for foreign companies, ruble weakness is here to stay, even though the ruble has appreciated by around 10% just over the last couple of weeks as the global economy has started to, if not recover, but at least to have the lockdowns lifted. But with further waves and outbreaks, the ruble is expected to stay fairly weak. We don't think we're going back to the 35 rubles per dollar level we saw before the Western sanctions were introduced in 2014. So generally, locally made products get a competitiveness boost. And if you haven't localized yet, again, you may suffer if you only import. So we would encourage to consider launching new products or starting your own production here. Of course, you have to be very careful. You have to do very thorough market analysis. You have to be careful which segment you're in, how the market might respond to different scenarios for this pandemic. What if it is indeed a long-term, at least 2-3 years? What if it recovers? You have to stress test, but generally there will be more and more support available for production localization, for which you also may want to grab a local partner. By the same token, and this is not spoken about that much, R&D and innovation has been developing very actively in Russia over the last 6 or 7 years. The technology parks, industrial parks, economic zones, there are more and more manufacturing facilities launched there, including by foreign companies. The technology parks are developing especially quickly. We do work with a couple of them across the country, and we see that companies there have achieved tremendous success in bringing their innovations to market. Now, I know that Russia has this sort of negative image that Russian entrepreneurs, they may be very smart scientifically and technically, but they're not very good in bringing products to market. Well, I have news for you. If you haven't noticed yet, a lot of the Russian companies and new technologies actually supply their products to countries worldwide. A lot of the Russian innovations are actually developed in places like Israel, and we happen to work on a number of them there. And also in other places, Russian talent is utilized. So as the importance of cost optimization, performance optimization products and services increases, and if you think back to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, you can see what kind of boost it provided to the development of various software as a service, infrastructure as a service products, video conferencing, data centers, online surveillance cameras, online education, telemedicine, m-health, mobile health. So if you're working in those areas which provide cost optimization solutions, sorry, you may want to consider partnering with local new technology companies and R&D institutes. They may have a lot of things up their sleeve. There is an abundance of local talent, and you may even want to grab something for your home market, which we find a lot of Asian companies doing now. So you may want to explore that route. Also, although your headquarters, your parent companies, sorry, speaking too long now, may be suffering as well. We're all in the same boat globally, but still, compared to some of the Russian competitors, you can have financial support from headquarters. Liquidity financing is more readily available, is much cheaper. And for you as foreign companies working here, this may be a good opportunity to target new market niches. Maybe you'll leapfrog some slower competitors. And also, we think it's very important, and we've actually seen this in China, where we also work. Sometimes not the best products get the best customers, but those that can offer better financial terms to local customers, suppliers also, and other counterparts. For that, you may want to consider building closer relations with local banks in conjunction with banks, ECAs, export credit agencies, insurers from your home countries, and you can develop offerings that can boost your competitiveness. Suppliers, business partners will be working with you more readily, and you can build a lot of partnerships that will help you expand your presence in Russia. Last but not least, the last two bullet points on the slide, consumers are increasingly going online for all kinds of services, and you have to think, is my market presence really visible online? Where do customers look to find the products and services they're searching for? Am I present there? We know that from experience, a lot of the foreign companies' web pages for Russia are really very basic. They don't offer even half of the functionality that visitors get in other markets, and it may be time to change that. You may need to think, how do I reach customers faster? For this, you have to be proactive. Also, in manufacturing, not just talking about online or IT, education, video conferencing, etc. Digitization will be the key to success in many sectors. Industry 4.0 is getting a very warm response in Russia. Authorities are very supportive of that. So are a lot of the local market players you may want to partner with. Also, if you look at Japan, for example, they're on a next level already. There's Connected Society 5.0. A lot of the government and city infrastructure digital services are growing rapidly, and we expect that to continue. So you may want to ramp up your IT platforms and products, and this could be a game changer for your business here. Next, Ilya, possible strategies.
So before we wrap up the presentation, let's go a little bit down to the level of, further down to the level of individual companies and see what other strategies and improvements in business models these specific companies that are operating in this crisis can take advantage of. So first of all, what I'm seeing with my clients right now, and what I'm recommending to my clients is that their business model and essentially financial model is what we're looking at here, has to be made in a certain way. It has to be done in a way that it can absorb even further deteriorations in both sales and margins. And so the only way to do that, the only way known to finance, is you have to replace more fixed costs with variable costs. While that may not be easy and maybe not necessary for the last couple of years, right now is the time to do that. And basically the given circumstances offer already built-in opportunities to do that. That's outsourcing of certain functions. That's making salaries more dependent on motivation and performance. Since many employees are now comfortable staying at home, a lot of employees actually would prefer to stay at home and work on part-time basis. So technically, what needs to be done here, if you're a CFO or if you're in a financial position or if you're a CEO or owner of a company, is you definitely need to have a very robust and bulletproof financial model that we have showed in our other presentation parts of this model. If you're interested in seeing certain bits and pieces and templates that we've prepared, feel free to reach out to me or to Andrew, and we'll send you that as well. Basically, you need to have a bulletproof financial model with multiple scenarios. You need to do a variable contribution margin analysis by segment, which means you need to know on variable basis each segment that your company has, each product or customer, or a lot of times product and customer, what kind of variable contribution margin these customers are generating now and are forecasted to generate. Because it may turn out that post-pandemic, a lot of customers, although they're big and although they seem like they are important to your business, but in fact, they're contributing no profit to you on a variable contribution margin basis, which means that your business might be better off discontinuing these clients and staying as a much smaller, much more compact, but a healthier business. And last but not least, zero-based budget. That's a must for all companies that are planning, that would like to stay alive here, because in order to answer the question, which expenses will I really need, which I don't, you have to go from the ground up, not from the top to the bottom. You have to go ground up, and you have to really re-engineer your business all over again. That was the question from Andre in terms of what are the man-made crises that are generated, and that second bullet point, that's definitely in that category. From what I see in terms of my clients, the biggest problem is that businesses are not prepared to downsize. They have never seen a scenario where their sales would go down by 50, 70, 80%. And so they're staring at this for the first time. And it's a very painful and difficult process for them to lay people off, to close locations. They spend a lot of time thinking about this, where in fact they should have been prepared somewhere in the back of their mind, on a napkin, wherever. They should have been prepared for scenarios like this. And especially it's difficult for successful Russian or foreign entrepreneurs that had, great success in the last couple of years. They've opened a bunch of locations. They told everyone about their success, and now they have to downsize, and it's very difficult, very painful for them. But they have to do it. There's no other choice. So what else do we hear from our clients, and what do we recommend? It's important to note that governments around the world have now given us a very good idea and very loud and clear proof that they can't close businesses in an eye blink. They don't have to think about this. If this epidemic comes back, and if more lockdowns will be necessary, and it's possible. Now there is a precedent, before there wasn't one. And so what does it mean for businesses? That means that negotiations with landlords, employees, and suppliers in terms of what happens if this happens again have to take place right now. This has to be now contingency in almost every business agreement. What happens if the business stops for a couple of months or for a month? What happens to payments? What happens to debt? What kind of payment holidays will I get? What kind of forbearance will I get? That has to be negotiated right now. What happens the next time? Now, there was a question from Andre about what happens in terms of the new business models. And what we're seeing here and what we're putting into key assumptions for models to our clients is following. Customers are changing, for example, way they shop, right? They avoid crowded places. That's why you have problems with travel industry that's going to persist for many years. That's a psychological part, right? But for example, if you own a grocery store or chain, you have to consider the fact that many people are not going to want to shop during the regular hours. They want to shop off peak times because they're just not comfortable being close to other people. I've seen it. I'm sure you've seen it. I'm sure you may be following the same pattern. We've talked about stay-at-home activities, and so a lot of retail and a lot of people are enjoying now staying home. Before, it would have been unthinkable. So now your business has to think about what can you provide to people in terms of their staying home comfort zone, and what can you provide for them? How more comfortable can you make it? Because it is possible for them to go back to that regime sometime in the next half of the year. Now, remote work. We've talked about this already, but many employers, we hear cases about cases like this in the United States, not all over Europe. I want to say Facebook has now decided to hire people outside of California. I don't think they're even asking people to return to work this year. And they're saying, look, they're great benefits. We have learned it. It's possible to work without what's called FaceTime. You don't have to be at work to be productive. They have learned it. And now they're saying, look, we're going to save money because we're going to hire people from other areas of the United States where people are, going to be standards of living are much lower. And we're going to be able to hire people not on full-time basis. And we're going to cut, obviously, on all the travel expenses and other types of expenses that are related to people being right there. Obviously, I'm not even talking about rent expenses, not things like that. So as difficult as it may have seemed a couple of years ago due to cultural differences or whatever preferences that your company may have, but it's been now proven that it's possible. And it works, and a lot of employees can be very effective. And then finally, you have this savers mentality that has now started coming into place, and so people are still feeling the uncertainty. They don't know if a vaccine has been in the works or it will be developed shortly or not, and so. For what we're seeing, there's a shift in quality. People are saying, look, I'm not going to maintain the same shopping patterns. I want to buy one time. I want to buy a quality product because, first of all, I don't want to go to the store all the time. And second, I don't know when I'll be able to afford buying next time. So you may want to look at these shifts in terms of selling more of a quality type of products. So there are other industries such as repair and services that we see are being impacted in a positive way.
Yeah.
Andrew, back to you.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. Actually, there was a question in the very beginning about vaccines, and from a healthcare standpoint, actually all this talk about vaccines, we find it potentially dangerous and counterproductive. There are no viable vaccines for any of the previous coronaviruses. They only last you maybe a couple of months, at most a year, okay, maybe 2 for some individuals. And it's not a given that a vaccine will be developed for this virus. We are working on two different types of treatment. One is pharmaceutical, the other is non-pharmaceutical, it's equipment-based. Treatments can be more effective. They are being developed. The healthcare industry is learning how to treat this beast better and more efficiently, but still we would not rely too much on vaccines. Viruses also tend to mutate. This particular virus maybe is not as prone to mutations as some of the other coronaviruses, but these things do happen. So a lot of people may get vaccinated, but you know, in a couple of months, they might fall ill again if a new strain comes along, and your antibodies, they're not manufactured in your body forever. You can't be loaded, you know, from head to toe with antibodies for every possible virus that's out there. So, you know, a new mutation comes along and you may not have enough antibodies to prevent you from getting sick. It may prevent you from, you know, falling ill severely, but that's also unless you have accompanying illnesses. And we wouldn't rely on vaccines too much, unfortunately, at this stage. If I'm proven wrong, I would be only happy. So sorry to, you know, cut in the more positive section of our presentation, but you have to be mindful of that. Just like Ilya is saying, consumers' purchasing power and habits are greatly affected. They may be buying less frequently, but better quality. And this also brings us to the next two bullet points, the last two bullet points on the slide. You may also want to consider your changing and optimizing your sales and distribution channels. I know that a lot of foreign companies working here, they rely on the classical sort of give your product to the distributor, he'll take care of everything, and you just reap the benefits and see the money piling up in your account. That hasn't been working that well lately. I'm sure some of you in some of the industries have noticed. You have to be proactive. Your distributors here will not be incentivized to, you know, sell you and promote you and only you unless you have an exclusive agreement. In a lot of the sectors, including healthcare and many other industries, they're working with other brands simultaneously. And, you know, whoever pays best or whoever is more active with, you know, promoting products on the marketplace actually gets the customer. So you have to consider in this new market reality, who will be motivated the most to market and sell your products? Who will be most capable, best positioned and effective partner for you now? And what kind of a cooperation would work best? You know, there are a lot of these sort of aggregator platforms online for different kinds of products. Maybe it's cosmetics and beauty products, maybe it's equipment. There's all kinds of websites. Are you present there now? Are you visible there now? Or are you, you know, number 50 or 60 somewhere down the list where no one even looks? You know, you have to consider who would be motivated to sell you in these market circumstances and maybe build new relations. Also drawing the example of the healthcare industry, you know, a couple of years ago, we worked with a major Japanese manufacturer of medical equipment. We were tasked by their headquarters to look at the activities of their Russian office, how effective they are. They sort of reached a plateau and their sales weren't growing. They had a significant market share in the two main markets of Moscow and St. Petersburg. They didn't bring even half of their available IT products, healthcare IT, into Russia due to various reasons. And we looked at how effective their Russian business is. And what we found out was that their mode of conduct was just handed over to a couple of distributors and, you know, just wait for the results. But you have to be proactive. You have to promote your products. You have to also service your products. You have to inform customers about available upgrades, functionality, new releases, and you have to be really out there and really proactive about selling your products. And if you don't feel that type of commitment, that type of relationship from your local partners, maybe it's time to make a switch. Because last bullet point, providing excellent service is all important and can be a key differentiator right now. Customers may be buying less frequently. They will be taking better care of their products. They may not jump from one service to another if we're talking about online services, for example, and whoever services them the best will be their product and service of choice, and you have to be that. We know that, let's move on. This is the final slide before final round of Q&A. We know that problem for many of the foreign companies based here, and not only in Russia, we work in Turkmenistan, Latvia, Vietnam, Israel, Indonesia. We see that all the time, that a lot of the local offices of foreign companies are very stiff. They're very rigid. It's difficult for them to change business models for a particular market. They value conformity and uniform approach to, across countries, to different marketplaces. There's a very long chain of command. There's, compliance and quality assurance issues, very complicated and time-consuming approval process, and therefore they're slow to adapt to circumstances, and we're fully understanding of that. But if you don't adapt quickly enough, someone else will. So as business management theory goes, let's look at some alternative business model options and what kind of new income you may be getting, how to better use your capacity, facilities, and staff. You have to adapt to this situation, which is really unique for the world economy. So as business management theory goes, you start with your customers. You take a close look again. What exactly do your customers need now? What kind of services? Where are they learning about them? Where are they getting them? At what point do they need it? Who exactly needs it and can pay the most for it? You have to maybe alter your business model, product range, priorities. Just start with the customer. Where are they learning about your products? Where are they getting them? What is important to them now? Also, as Ilya spoke on the previous slide, what kind of long-term trends are forming now? What will be relevant in Russia in 1, 3, 5 years? And correspondingly, what shape does your business have to assume to answer to these challenges? Where do you see your business in Russia in a couple of years down the road? You have to ask yourself that question. Also, continuing the thought from the previous slide, it may be wise to focus on sectors and products expected to see the strongest growth and highest profit margins. Now is not the time to be complacent. Now is not the time to just continue doing whatever you've been doing all along in all the other markets where you're present. You have to focus, you have to calculate which segments will be seeing the strongest growth and the best margins. I remember, and just 2 more minutes before we finish, I remember us working 8 years ago with one of the leading polypropylene and polystyrene roll manufacturers. This is the stuff that's used in various kinds of packaging for yogurts, bottles, teacups, containers, things like that. And they were banging the doors, and they were supplying their products. They were one of the top 5 manufacturers. They were supplying to all the leading dairy producers out there, like Campina, Wimbledon, Danone, but they weren't getting the margins. And that sector, yogurts and other dairy products, was growing maybe 2-3% per year. We looked at the profitability. We saw that massive new polypropylene capacity is due to be launched in Russia over the next 1 or 2 years, which means drastically reduced input prices, therefore higher margins for them. We advised them to shift to polypropylene more instead of polystyrene. We also advise them to look at airline catering services, the rapidly growing meat delicatessen segment, which is using a lot of packaging. And although they were unprofitable for the previous 4 years after the 2008 crisis, they finally managed to turn around, but just because of this very detailed assessment of the profitability and the growth of their customer market segments. Also, the second point, actually, a lot of these things may be sacrosanct to foreign companies. Production capacity, facilities, it's supposed to be set in stone. You know, if you're a tire manufacturing plant, you manufacture tires, right? You don't do anything else. If you're a, let's say, sausage plant, you make sausages, but you may want to consider what else can I use my assets for? What am I sitting on that can generate cash here and now? What else can I be making using my equipment, using my facilities, stores, also technologies, IP rights? You know, are they bringing money to me here and now? Same thing with staff, with personnel. You know, if you envision what shape your business should take, what format it should be in a couple of years, maybe as long as you're keeping them employed, as long as they're paying them salary, they can be working on reshaping your business, maybe working on your online presence or your long forgotten website, or working on restructuring, reformatting your relations with distributors and partners, and thus generating more profit further down the road. You have to start preparing now and use your assets wisely. Last but not least, if that fails, if you know, there's nothing much you can do with existing assets, or you know, customers more or less want the same things in your industry, maybe you can't transition quickly enough. Of course, you have to look at your costs and cash flows and get rid of things that are redundant, that are inefficient. Word of advice, if you look at Russia specifically, you know, foreign companies always struggle with non-payments in Russia. Historically, you may want to revise the contract payment terms, maybe make shorter term arrangements or smaller batch, more frequent supplies and subsequently payments, both with customers and suppliers, and reduce that risk of, you know, huge payment not coming in time, or you paying a huge amount to your supplier and them going bankrupt in 2 months. You may want to break that down into smaller payments. That's about it. Let's move on to questions and answers now. If we don't manage to answer your questions right now, our contacts are provided on the last page of the presentation, websites, emails. Feel free to reach out, talk to us. We'll be happy to answer your questions and support you going forward. With this, I probably stop screen sharing. And questions, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, thank you, Andrew. So we got a couple of questions in chat here, so maybe we can start from those. We got a question from Henry, and let's read the question here. We're making pneumatic components for all sorts of machines among the medical, food industry, automatic system, gas, chemical industry, etc. So here's the question. Any references of building from bottom up structure or guidelines will be much appreciated. We're a machinery components manufacturer in Taiwan.
Ilya, do you want to take that?
Go ahead. Go ahead, take it.
In terms of machinery components, I assume the company is already supplying things to Russia now. If so, I would advise, first of all, before we go from the bottom up, I'd look top down first. see where your customers are, where your components are used, and we would advise doing comparative analysis of your customer segments, how they're growing, where which sectors are expected to see strongest demand. Machinery in general, transportation equipment should recover, especially in cargo transportation. There's a lot of interesting things going on in healthcare at the moment. There's also a lot of interesting new productions launched in chemicals, in computers and electronics. So you might want to consider, whom to supply to. As for the bottom up part, I don't know if you're referring to zero-based budgeting, Henry. If you could maybe voice your question in more detail orally or in the chat, we'd be able to answer. What kind of, it depends on what form of presence you already have here. With regards, if you're only supplying to Russia, we would suggest looking at, the profitability, the margins you're getting with specific customers. And again, that may depend on the industry prospects in those particular segments. Ilya?
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I would just add to that couple of words that in order to answer the question and to provide or model that bottom-up structure before any funds are even invested, before any investments are made into expansion into Russia, nothing would prevent your business, I would think, from getting acquainted and trying to get some letters of commitments in terms of hypothetical question. Look, if I bring this product here, and if I'm going to price it at this level, and if it's going to be available through the following logistical channel, will you buy? Will any purchases be made? So basically, that way you would be able to do a research in terms of viability of your business here in Russia, and you would be able to build a somewhat accurate financial model that would use some sort of assumptions on sales, revenue, and margins before the first dollar, or ruble in this case, is invested. Obviously, it's hard to comment in real time about the specific business that you're referring to, but it's it's specifically our expertise. Andrew's even more so than mine is to make these types of predictions and make and build those types of models for businesses that would love to see the options and would love to see the chances that they will be successful here in Russia, and what will it take. And at the end of the day, right, we're all looking at the ROI number. So we'll be looking at how quickly the business will reach break-even situation, and how quickly margins will be able to cover the initial investment. So that's that. And we also have another question from Andrei. Question is in Russian. Actually, it's in both languages. So thank you from Henry. So here's a question from Andrei. Are state-owned corporations really a game changer against public and private corporations?
Let me try to answer that. I think that over the last couple of years, yes, the role of state-owned corporations has increased in Russia. Are they, and that is expected to persist, I would think, especially with many of the companies failing Some of them in Russia might go under government control if they haven't done that already. There are a lot of the high-tech companies under Rostec and other government institutions and companies that can be expected to be the scene in the next couple of years. But in terms of whether they're a game changer, I think that a lot of the change in Russia will be driven by, at least by government support. We really appreciate the way Russian government policy has become smarter over the past year, and even in response to this pandemic, that plans are being worked out to stimulate the long-term development of strategically important, promising, lucrative new industries, and also some of the traditional industries, their modernization and upgrade. Whether or not the Russian government will succeed in implementing those plans and how wisely they will be devised remains to be seen. A lot of the attention is actually being distracted by this pandemic. Ideally, what we should be seeing in Russia and in other countries, and we're not seeing it yet, even in Western countries, is what kind of new economic model, what kind of new jobs, new workplaces, new industries should be supported as the economies in respective geographies respond to this pandemic. Online services, e-government, things like that. People contact tracing even of suspected COVID-19 patients. That requires a lot of people. And what the government in Russia hasn't been doing yet is it hasn't been supporting the transition of people and jobs of companies to work in those new sectors, including those that will be thriving, especially IT, telemedicine. There's a lot of things to do. And if the government could only employ people there and give them jobs, and they would get salaries, maybe make procurement orders to more companies to facilitate the development of those sectors, that would greatly support the local economy. We're only hopeful that that will happen at some point in time. I hope that answers your question, at least partially.
And just to follow up real quick, Andre, it's probably, at least in my opinion, it's not going to hurt private corporations because, as you know, state-owned corporations sign enormous amount of contracts and subcontracts where they specifically have tender for specific work that they cannot do or produce themselves, and they engage many private or even a small or public companies to do the work. Because let's face it, just like in any just like in any country of the world, government or state-owned companies, they're bureaucratic, they're slow a lot of times, and they're as Andrew just mentioned, they're very slow to react. And so without private business, without small business, medium business, or even public companies, they wouldn't be able to get the job done. So yes, absolutely, they will be using private companies are going to stay in the game.
Yeah, there's some more in-depth stuff coming in from Andre about financial innovation, securitization, monetization of assets. Definitely, it has potential. We also do work on some fintech services for Russian Asian Investment Fund, both in Russia and Israel. And there is potential. I think, first of all, in terms of monetization of assets, you have to know what to use them for. First of all, you have to find ways to use them more effectively, right? Maybe reorient them to new products and services. And then, of course, yes, that definitely makes sense.
As far as financial innovation and leverage, there's a saying: the more things change, the more they're the same. At the end of the day, no matter how you monetize or securitize or what do you do, at the end of the day, business only has equity, inventory, receivables, fixed assets, and business owners have their personal property, their cars, and their other funds, their CDs, their deposits in the bank. That's it. So no matter how you split the pie, you're only playing with these assets. And whether you're a bank or not, or whether you're an alternative leverage structure, a smart businessman would never be able to lend on against these assets more than a certain percentage of liquidation value or market value of these assets. So you could change the formatting, you can call it something else, but as far as your question of increasing the leverage potential, I don't see that happening, because any party that will eventually be giving the money to that business will be doing the math the same way. They will be counting what assets company has, and whether, if they will be tokenizing, doing tokenization, for example, of equity. You're still going to have to figure out what the company is worth, and you will still have to build discounted cash flow forecast to do that, or do some kind of a market multiple assumption. That's all. All right.
Robotic capitalism.
Yeah, we have looks like a proposal from Andre. I proposed the thesis from slaveholding capitalism to robotic capitalism. Thank you. And from Henry, we have thank you from taking time hosting the Zoom meeting and providing treasure market information. Let's ask our audience if there are any more questions. If you can't think of any questions right now, you have our contact information. We'll be more than happy to answer your questions in the email or during the phone call, whatever format you prefer. So any more questions right now?
And while we're waiting for the questions, I want to say some final words from the organizers. I want to thank our speakers. Thank you, Ilya. Thank you, Andrew. A very informative seminar. And I want to mention that this webinar was held by Council for Financial and Industrial and Investment Policy of Chamber of Commerce and Industry of the Russian Federation, with organizational support of National Investment Platform and the Center for the Competence of the Digital Economy of Plekhanov Russian University of Economics. So if you have some questions, please write them or raise your hand to ask them orally. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
So the webinar is over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.